Good evening. Welcome to What's Ahead. This is our opportunity for us to have a conversation about what we've been doing and what we hope to do in 2021 and beyond. We're going to start by showing you a brief video, and then we'll come back and we'll begin our conversation.
The COVID-19 pandemic has fundamentally changed our lives and shown the enormous impact of systemic racism and inequities in America. Caught in between two pandemics, Black and Brown Virginians continue to bear the brunt of not only COVID-19, but also unjust, unfair systems that devalue their lives and leave them behind. Because of these critical issues, our present focus is on achieving three goals: protecting the life and health of people who are incarcerated, protecting the right to vote during this pandemic and guaranteeing the right to vote for all, and reimagining the role of police in our society. Each of these goals is centered on ending structural racism and fixing systems that have targeted Black and Brown Virginians for generations. Together with our members and supporters, our community partners, and centering directly impacted people, the ACLU of Virginia is an unrelenting advocate for change in the courts, in the legislature, and with the public. We are also working to change hearts and minds through public education. For more than 50 years, the ACLU of Virginia has upheld our commitment to defend civil rights and civil liberties for everyone in Virginia. We will not back down or back off until we achieve equality and freedom for all, and systemic racism is no longer a hallmark of our civic and government institutions.
Thank you. That sort of sets the stage for our conversation tonight. And we won't back down is seriously part of what we're going to be talking about. So, as I wrote to you in January in my letter, the political landscape, obviously, over the last 4 years and certainly in the last year has changed dramatically. And it's changed dramatically over my entire 8 years at the Virginia ACLU, but no more so than in this last year. Whether in the courts or in the legislature, the ACLU has found some success in recent years where in the past we've only been able to kind of hold the ground. For example, in the legislature for too many years, the ACLU of Virginia was forced to spend most of our time and resources fending off bad bills. But this year, our perseverance has paid off, and we are being able to make some real progress, which I'm going to talk a little bit about with some great enthusiasm. Instead of just challenging every bad abortion bill passed by the Virginia legislature in court in the past, we've helped pass legislation in the last couple of years to repeal the regulations designed to drive abortion providers out of business. And we've really begun to create a healthcare environment in which abortion access is assured for all who need those fundamental health services. Instead of just fighting voter suppression, we expanded access to the ballot box in the courts this year by setting aside a witness requirement that had been a barrier to absentee voting. And in the legislature, we made so many changes in Virginia's voting laws that we moved from 49th in the nation in the ease of voting to 12th, an amazing transformation of access, but we're not done yet. Instead of relying on federal courts to protect people against discrimination, has been the case in the past. For example, in our Grimm case, we have helped Virginia become the first state in the South with a law banning discrimination against LGBTQ people in housing, employment, and public accommodations. But there's more to do. Instead of just relying on police to do the right thing, we published an agenda for police reform in 2017. And with your help since then, we've accomplished a lot of it, including helping to pass laws requiring disciplinary action for use of excessive force and triggering mandatory loss of license for a police officer if that officer is determined to have violated state law prohibiting excessive force or new statewide misconduct standards that are going to be put in place over the next year. But these new laws are only going to work if they're enforced, and more must be done if we are truly to ensure that Virginia is a commonwealth, the commonwealth that we all want and which we all deserve. We need to build on these changes and take additional action to ensure that the government protects our existing and our newly established rights. The 2021 General Assembly session is now underway, and let me tell you, it is moving fast. It is a 30-day session, although the governor just today issued a proclamation starting a special session next week when this session is meant to conclude on the 11th. And we're making some amazing progress on our key priorities, on which we will need your help now, tonight, and in the future. Just today, the Senate Privileges and Elections Committee took the first step toward putting an amendment on the ballot in 2022 that, if passed by the voters, would ensure that every Virginian 18 and older can never lose their right to vote. We've been working since 2016 to change the conversation about our constitutional disenfranchisement of people who have convicted of felonies, from talking about giving something back to restoring rights. We're changing the conversation to talking about why those rights should never have been taken away in the first place. We are trying to move from a situation in which 1 in 7 Black voters in Virginia are disenfranchised because of our felony disenfranchisement law to a situation in which no voter is disenfranchised ever for any reason. When I look at our Virginia Constitution and I see the language that was put in there in the post-Reconstruction period and really confirmed and solidified in the 1902 Constitution by people who made it very clear they were doing it simply to keep Black people from voting, I think of it as being very much like the 13th Amendment. You know, the 13th Amendment says we've abolished slavery except if you are incarcerated. And our own felon disenfranchisement provision says, hey, you have a right to vote unless you're incarcerated. I think both things are wrong, and I hope someday we'll amend the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery everywhere. But we can, in Virginia, take the first step to guaranteeing the right to vote to everyone that can never be taken away for any reason for anyone. That would make us the first state in the South to have universal suffrage. And if we were able to do this, it would truly be a remarkable step forward. We would be joining Maine, Vermont, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia in guaranteeing everybody a lifelong, irrevocable right to vote. We're also working to ensure that police are held accountable. As I mentioned, we've now got new statewide standards that'll be going into effect over the next year that mean that police who engage in serious misconduct can lose their certification to police, which is a huge step forward. But the other element of making sure that our police do not feel that they are able to get away with anything is to make sure that every Virginian who is injured or who has a family member who's killed by police in the performance of their duties can go to court in Virginia before Virginia judges and seek damages for any injury or death that's caused by people on the job. We have made great strides. In the 2020 special session, we had for the first time made it possible for every locality to consider having direct civilian oversight of police, including being able to issue subpoenas in disciplinary cases. We also have ended the practice of forfeiting people's assets before they're convicted of a crime. But now we really do need this state cause of action. And it doesn't look like we're going to get it done in this session. The House bill has been referred to the Crime Commission for further study. But holding police accountable in court is going to continue to be a goal of ours. And we're going to need your help to make it happen. We're also working with racial justice advocates to revise legislation that would legalize marijuana so that it directly addresses the harms Black and brown people in their communities have suffered from years of disparate law enforcement as a result of the unfortunate war on drugs. We're in a situation in which we are about to legalize marijuana in Virginia, and we need to make sure it's done right. It needs to be done in a way that assures that discriminatory policing is something of the past, and done in a way that assures that the revenues that are produced by this new market are invested in the communities and the people who were harmed by the war on drugs. We've got some work to do on the marijuana bills that are working their way through the House and Senate in order to achieve those goals and to have the bills live up to our values. But we are making remarkable progress, and I want you to watch this space, because it is going to be an interesting couple of years as we move toward legalization and a new regulated market environment. But it's only going to be okay if part of that is not adding a whole bunch of new crimes to our code, like a new crime for smoking in public, or for offering somebody a toke while you're standing on the sidewalk would under the bill as it's currently being considered, be a new crime, or a new crime for being a passenger in a car where marijuana is, and so we don't want a whole bunch of new crimes, so we'll just continue the practice of disparate and discriminatory enforcement. But we do want a legal market that is fair for everyone, and also is inclusive and provides economic opportunity for the very people who were harmed by the previous system. Next, I mean, we talked a little bit in the video about the conditions in prisons, and we worked very hard to try to ensure that people who are most vulnerable to COVID were released from prisons. We've made not nearly as much progress on that front as I would have liked us to. We have, created a situation in which the Department of Corrections is required to report on the people being released. They're required to take steps to address this issue. But the difficulties of litigating prison condition cases in federal court make it very hard to compel results that the Department of Corrections doesn't agree to. So we're continuing to work on that, and we're continuing to work on conditions of confinement in a new way as well. Delegate Patrick Hope has a bill that would establish an ombuds office that would, for the first time, really give meaningful outside oversight to our prison system. And that bill is not going to get passed in this session, but we're hopeful that some language is going to be inserted in the budget that will allow us to set a working group together to talk about what that kind of office would look like and what it would actually cost. One of the problems we've been having on passing good legislation that has to do with criminal legal reform and prison reform is that every time we think we have a good idea, the administration hangs a price tag on it that is just, hard to understand and certainly hard to overcome. So we also want to end solitary confinement in our prisons, and they hung a $23 million price tag on ending solitary confinement. In a circumstance in which logic and common sense would tell you that holding a lot of people in separate cells might require more staffing and more expense than not doing that, but we shall see. More to come there, and we will be working hard to achieve some changes in that area. We also know that the protections afforded by the new Virginia Values Act that I mentioned, which is the new law that not just protects LGBTQ people from discrimination in public accommodations, housing, and employment, but it really is the most comprehensive civil rights law Virginia has ever had in terms of covering everyone, race, gender, national origin, pregnancy discrimination, and LGBTQ people. But it's not as strong as it could be, and there are some amendments that are being considered in this session that will strengthen the protections and particularly in the area of preventing harassment. And we hope ultimately strengthening the protections by extending them to more employers. All of this work is about one thing. It's about making sure that no matter what happens across the Potomac River at that capital, we've done what we need to do at our capital on the James to make Virginia a commonwealth that welcomes and protects the rights of everyone. And this is work we need to continue to do no matter how we see the change in the administrations in DC. One thing we've learned over the last 4 years is that we can't always rely on the federal government to be a partner in protecting our civil rights and civil liberties. Or can we expect the federal courts, particularly given the appointments that have been made recently, that we can't rely on them to stand as a bulwark against hateful discrimination and attacks on our freedoms by government, and particularly by the police. I mean, I'll give you an example. In the Grimm case, in the years that we've been litigating on behalf of Gavin Grimm to end discrimination against transgender students in Virginia public schools, we started out with the government as a partner. We ended up we then went through a phase where the government was our opponent, the federal government was our opponent, and then we're back to a potential possibility where the federal government might be on our side again. But the fact is that when the federal government flip-flops back and forth on, discrimination regulations under Title IX and other federal laws, the courts basically stop listening to anything they say anyway. So we've got to not think about everything that we've done in the past being about the federal Constitution and federal civil rights, but we need to have Virginia Constitution and Virginia statutory protections for civil rights and civil liberties that will sustain us in times when a court might decide, for example, that the Equal Protection Clause of the federal Constitution or Title IX of the Education Amendments doesn't extend to sexual orientation and gender identity, which would really be a difficult problem until and unless we repeal our marriage amendment and until we establish all of the positive protections that we need to in Virginia law. We've learned we must confront racial inequities in our government directly and intentionally before we can ever become the more perfect union envisioned at our country's founding. And our job is not just to fight back against the erosion of our rights happening, and if they happen in federal courts or in Congress, we have to take positive action in Virginia to protect the freedom and rights of all people here. So what do we have to do? We as Virginians have to commit to forward progress. We've got to repeal the death penalty, which it looks like we might actually accomplish in this legislative session, 2021. I know if it comes out of the House and Senate, the governor has said he will sign a bill repealing the death penalty. We would become the first state in the South to do that. We have to end solitary confinement. We have to achieve racial justice at the ballot box by securing the right to vote for all Virginians. Restoration will not get us racial justice. We must convince the legislature that Virginians deserve to be allowed to hold police accountable in court. We must change the way we do public safety, starting with the legislation around marijuana, legalizing marijuana that truly removes opportunities for discriminatory policing and ensures investment of new marijuana revenues in the Black and brown communities that have been harmed. We have to enact protections for LGBTQ people. We have to end sex discrimination and normalize access to abortion as a basic human right and a basic health care. And we must not allow fear of violence to empower discriminatory policing or unauthorized mass surveillance by government. And we have to continue to work without tiring to achieve racial justice without exception. I know that's a big agenda. And we've accomplished a lot with your help, and I know we can do all of these things if you stay committed and involved with us in our work. We're going to be able to sustain our growth and the investments and be able to make the investments that we need to succeed if you all stand with us. So now we're ready to take your questions.
Good evening. Thank you, Claire, so much for that look at what we've been up to. I'm Meredith Mason. I'm the Senior Communications Manager for the ACLU of Virginia. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. So it looks like we have at least one question. So I would encourage everyone to pop some questions in the chat. We'll take them as you give them. And I've been to enough of our member events that I know y'all are a questionable bunch. So I know you've got some
questionable bunch or
questionable, and sometimes more ways than one. So our first question is, when do you expect the vote to occur in the Virginia Senate on the right to vote constitutional amendment?
Tomorrow. Because of the accelerated time frame we're on, and we sent out an email asking you to take action tonight, basically, to tell senators and members of the House of Delegates that you want a right to vote and not just a restoration of vote. The bill came out of committee today 10-5, 10 votes positive and 5 votes against. It goes directly to the floor of the Senate, and because tomorrow is what we call crossover, which means that tomorrow is the deadline for Senate bills to get out of the Senate and House bills to get out of the House, they have to vote on it tomorrow, or it doesn't, it will die. So tomorrow is the day that we need you all to tell people to vote the right way when Senate Joint Resolution 272 comes to the floor of the Senate. And you can watch the Senate online live streaming. We'll put the link in the chat for you.
All right, sounds good. So we have gotten a few more questions. The next one, I think you'll be interested in because you're always in favor of unlikely allyships. Do you have allies on the police force for holding officers responsible for police misconduct? I often hear that good officers want this too.
Well, I think it's really interesting. We have been proposing that there be statewide professional standards for police. It used to be under Virginia law, you couldn't lose your certificate to police unless you were convicted of a felony or certain misdemeanors. And we got that law changed to say you could lose your certificate if you violated new provisions about excessive force or if you violated these new statewide standards of conduct. The police brass have always been a little bit more open to the idea of a statewide licensure approach. It's such that we recommended, and the line officers haven't been all that supportive. But in recent time, that started to shift, and I think it started to shift for two reasons. One is it is very difficult to argue that you should be paid like professionals if you aren't regulated like professionals. And when the cosmetologists have higher statewide standards than the police do in terms of when they can lose their license to do that work, it becomes pretty clear that it's hard to argue you're a true professional. So professionalism has helped, or the idea that we should get to professionalism. And the second, obviously, is that many people are clear that no one wants the truly bad actors in their departments. And we don't think that this is just a problem of bad actors. We think there are systemic issues that statewide standards will help address. But we do also agree that we can't really address the systemic problems as long as we still have people in these various and sundry departments who feel invulnerable because there's no punitive action that can be taken against them if they engage in excessive force or other behavior, which should be and will constitute professional misconduct.
Absolutely. All right, Jane asks, can you talk a little bit more about the strategy to end solitary confinement? Is it legislative, litigation, and is an executive order a possibility?
Well, this has been really frustrating because in the first Obama administration, I think it was the first Obama administration, I know that the governor was McAuliffe. President Obama announced that he was by executive order ordering the end of solitary confinement in juvenile systems and ordering a process of considering the end of solitary confinement in all adult federal facilities. It must have been the beginning of the second term. And we immediately called on Governor McAuliffe to do exactly the same thing, to issue an executive order and tell the Department of Corrections and tell the Department of Juvenile Justice to stop using solitary confinement. That didn't happen. We renewed that ask of Governor Northam when he took office. It still didn't happen. And we ended up having to sue. And one of the things we still have a pending class action to end solitary confinement in Red Onion and Wellens Ridge prisons. We have settled a case involving a man who was held for 12 years in solitary because he couldn't speak English, and their system for allowing you to step down out of solitary required you to be able to read and keep a journal in English. We settled that case and got two wonderful things: some financial compensation for Mr. Reyes, and importantly, a commitment to do language access in the department. Second solitary case settled in the last week, brought by some MacArthur, which is one of our colleagues in our other cases at the MacArthur Foundation. And that was a case in which someone was held in solitary for 600 days and became mentally ill, and they settled that case. So I don't know why they continue to litigate these cases instead of just doing the right thing and ending solitary, but that's one of our strategies. Will we continue to litigate the issue because we think holding anybody in solitary for more than a maximum of 14 days is cruel and unusual punishment. But we're also looking at the legislature, and we have introduced with our coalition, there's a Stop Solitary Coalition that's very active. We have tried, last year we introduced a bill to to require the department to put some data out there. So, because they keep saying they don't use solitary, but we all knew they do. And this year we actually put in a bill to ban solitary confinement, and it got killed in the Senate, largely because it has this $23 million price tag attached to it. And we can't get it out of Senate Finance. So we'll continue. And then the ombudsperson bill, I think, will help bring attention to what's going on and actually really give people in these facilities someone who is really looking out for them all of the time. And we think that'll help. So we've tried executive action. We haven't gotten anywhere. We're in the courts and we've been successful, and we'll continue to litigate, and we'll continue to seek legislative end to solitary at the same time. So we're using every and public education as well. We put out a report a couple of years ago to try to help the public understand why this is an important issue for us to resolve. So we've used all our tactics: public education, legislation, executive action, and the courts when we haven't been able to get things to happen elsewhere.
Absolutely. And the Stop Solitary Coalition has been such a powerful tool in this. And
right. Yeah.
There was a great article this morning in the Virginian Pilot that I'd encourage everybody to seek out, that featured David Smith, who's one of the members of that coalition and was held in solitary confinement for a long time. So he's been a powerful advocate. And on that same topic, someone else asked about reasonable, humane limits on how long someone can be confined. And you mentioned 14 days.
Well, I mean, the international standard is no more than 14 days. We obviously don't think anybody should be in solitary ever, because the decompensation begins to occur much more rapidly than 14 days. So we just need new strategies. There are other systems of incarceration in the world that don't use solitary and have people who have done, really bad things out to deserve to be incarcerated, but they manage those people in a system that doesn't require solitary confinement. So if you read our report, which is online on our website, we go into a lot of detail about what the international human rights standard is and why we think our Virginia department is in violation of what human rights laws would tolerate.
Thank you. So the next question says, I heard you focus on loss of voting rights for those who are incarcerated. I thought all felony convictions reach that result, not just incarceration. Can you clarify?
Thank you. I mean, that's a really good point and a good clarifying point. Anyone who's convicted of a felony loses their right to vote permanently under the Virginia Constitution, unless and until a governor decides to give it back. And it doesn't matter whether you're actually imprisoned or whether you're have a suspended sentence. Anyone who is convicted of a felony loses their right permanently until the governor chooses to give it back.
Thank you.
Thanks for that clarifying question. That's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Can qualified immunities still be a defense for police in Virginia? And if so, is the ACLU working to eliminate that, and how?
Well, here's how we're going about it. Qualified immunity is a concept that applies in cases brought in federal court to vindicate your constitutional rights in circumstances in which the argument is that the police behavior is in contravention of constitutional standards. And the court-made rule is that somehow people shouldn't, it started out, maybe it had more sense to it at the beginning, but the idea was that you shouldn't be held accountable for violating somebody's rights if you didn't know what they were. But now it's come to the ridiculous level that if there isn't a case that has a description of a behavior, which is exactly what you did, then you have immunity from any kind of recovery against you in a constitutional case, because the theory is you didn't know what you did was unconstitutional. Qualified immunity has become it's sort of a catch-22, because you go into court to sue a police officer or another a government official for an unconstitutional act. And you never get to the question whether what they did was unconstitutional, because the case gets dismissed on qualified immunity, which means that it freezes what is unconstitutional at a given point in time, because you can never get a new substantive decision. So it's a terrible, terrible judicially created limit on people's rights. We have chosen in Virginia, our most recent effort to address this has been to suggest that the federal government is going to either deal with qualified immunity in federal courts under the federal constitution or not. But what we want to do is give people a right of action to be able to sue police in Virginia courts in front of Virginia judges under Virginia law that doesn't accord immunity, either sovereign immunity or qualified immunity. That would be an explicit right to vindicate your rights. We've looked at a lot of different options. One is very broad and expansive and looks a bit like a parallel federal statute called 42 USC 1983, which gives you a private cause of action to protect your constitutional rights. Then we've also looked at things that are a little bit more narrow that say you have a cause of action to address anybody who violates the new statutory limits on excessive use of force or engages in professional misconduct and loses their certificate. But we are going to keep working to find a way that if you are injured or a family member of yours is killed, you have a way to go to court and recover damages against police in Virginia without confronting immunities that shield them and frankly send a message to the officers that they're invulnerable.
Thank you. So our next question is about private prisons. There was a bill to ban the use of private prisons in Virginia, and that failed. Can you talk about why that bill failed?
Well, in Virginia, we want to keep, in Virginia, we have one private prison. It's a prison that is operated by the GEO group, and there's only one of them. And there are more private prisons in the federal system than in the Virginia system, but in Virginia we have one. We want to keep the focus on conditions in all of the facilities. I think there's sometimes there can be an illusion that somehow if you ban private prisons, you've fixed some major problem. It's a very small part of the problem. Yes, I don't like private prisons. I don't like the fact they have a contract that basically guarantees them a census as a part of the contract. It creates a bad incentive to incarcerate people. But I also want to be sure that we don't get so focused on ending the use of private prisons that we lose sight of the fact that there are 25 to 30,000 people in our facilities across the Commonwealth who we hear from all the time about inadequate medical care, inadequate dental care, no mental health treatment, and other real offenses against decency that occur in our prison systems. So I think people should continue to work to end private prisons in Virginia and elsewhere. And I think we should focus on getting this ombudsperson in place and addressing in every other way we can, the conditions that folks are confronting in the facilities in which they're incarcerated, and particularly right now during the pandemic.
Absolutely. So switching back to voting rights, how is the loss of voting rights enforced? Is there a statewide registry for that?
Well, everybody has to register in order to be able to vote. And people who register who have lost their voting rights because they were convicted of a felony would be committing another felony if they registered to vote when they were not entitled to vote. So the idea is that, like the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, it's a self-enforcing thing. You know that you were convicted of a felony, and you should not then feel that you could go and register to vote. Now, obviously that creates all kinds of problems, like the one woman in Texas who mistakenly understood that her rights had been restored, and she ended up being prosecuted for another felony. Part of the reason why we are so focused on a guaranteed right to vote for everyone that can never be taken away is there's nothing clearer than I'm turned 18 and I am now qualified to vote. if I am a resident of Virginia and a citizen. And there's no confusion later on about who's entitled to vote and who's not entitled to vote. And we don't have to track down a whole lot of data on who got released when and whether they've served their, served their entire period of supervised. One of the proposals that was pending in the House was that you would get your voting rights back, quote, automatically at the end of active supervision. Well, nobody really knew what active supervision was. So now it says after a period of imprisonment, but it's not entirely clear how you'll know when that is. Does that include probation? So, the clearest thing to do is to just say you're 18, you're a citizen, and you're a resident of Virginia, you get to vote.
Yeah. And I just saw a comment from David Smith, who I mentioned earlier. He snuck in to let us know that the solitary confinement bill isn't quite dead yet, as Senator Morrissey is still working a couple avenues to keep it alive, despite it coming out of the Appropriations and Finance Committee with the clause.
Yeah, when we talk about the clause, the clause is something that the Senate Finance Committee puts on. They're like mimicking what happens in Washington, where Washington, on the Hill in Washington, there are appropriations bills and there are authorization bills, and you can get a program authorized, but it never gets funded. And that's how they vote for things they like, but they know it's never going to happen because they're never going to put money in the Appropriations Act for it. Well, Virginia is doing a little bit of that. The Senate Finance Committee will vote something out that they don't want to vote against on policy grounds, that they put the clause on. And the clause says, as David points out, this only goes into effect if it's funded. And then they don't put any money in the budget. And so it doesn't ever go into effect, but they can say they voted in solitary confinement. So I think that's, it's illusory the way that it comes out. So if we really want to ban solitary, we need to figure out what it's actually going to cost and a realistic cost assessment, and we need to fund it and we need to get it done. But thank you, David. David is an amazing advocate against solitary confinement. He was at our initial press conference when we issued our report, and he's been an absolute joy to work with on our Stop Solitary Coalition and in all respects. And he does amazing work.
Yeah, he does. So our next question is a bit more broad. How can we increase opportunities to find compromise amongst differing opinions?
Well, if I had the solution to that,
right?
I mean, I think one of the things that I've found over, I hate to put this out there in public, but my first session in the General Assembly was 1986. And there used to, at that time, you actually could sit down and talk to people. And there were only what I would call 3 or 4 or 5 marquee issues that you couldn't have a conversation with folks and find some common ground and some way to be together on something that moved things forward. That has become increasingly less likely over my tenure and my experience with the Virginia legislature. And it's one of the saddest things that I've observed over time. It is now the case that, and part of what contributed to all this was all these groups that doing questionnaires and writing their questionnaires so that it was a yes, no answer. And so people came to the legislature having answered, 25 questionnaires, each of which had 85 questions, and all of them were yes or no. And so then they weren't able to have a conversation because they'd said, I'm for this or I'm for that, and there wasn't any middle ground. And that's contributed, frankly, to the inability to find common ground and compromise. So I think we all need to read up a lot on transformational mediation and other strategies for how we come to the table in talking about various and sundry issues. Sometimes it's necessary to be an absolutist and say this is the way it has to be because it's really morally right. And sometimes there's a lot more room to have a conversation about what would be a positive outcome than just an either or a yes, no kind of approach.
Right. Thank you. So I have a two-part question next. What are you most proud of as Executive Director of the ACLU of Virginia over the last 8 years? And what do you think our biggest challenges moving forward will be?
I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my closing remarks, but I have to say, I tell people this all the time, I don't think there's been any day in my career that was more rewarding and more profound for me than the day that we found out that the United States Supreme Court had denied certiorari in our marriage equality case. We had brought the marriage equality case in Virginia on behalf of two couples. One couple had been married in DC and their marriage wasn't recognized in Virginia, and one couple who wanted to get married in Virginia but hadn't been legally allowed to. And the couple that was married in DC, there was one of the two partners to the marriage was a federal employee, and she drove from their home in suburban Virginia into the district every day. And when she crossed the bridge into the Potomac and got to her desk, she was a married woman with a child. And when she got up from her desk to drive home in the evening and cross the bridge over the Potomac back into Virginia, her marriage was void and she was a single mother again. And that was her experience every day. And I got to call her and say, you know, today when you drive home, you'll still be married. And you'll still be a married woman with a child, and your marriage won't be void this afternoon. And that was amazing. And then the other couple was a couple in which one of the partners was very open about the fact that she was an epileptic and was very concerned about what might happen to the child of their relationship, who happened to be her biological child, and what would happen if something happened to her and she wasn't able to, and would people respect the other partner's guardianship? And marriage solves all those problems. Marriage sets up those relationships and creates the family structure that's legally protected. And I got to call them and tell them that the next day they could go and get their license. And we did these calls in our conference room with everybody there on the speakerphone. And we found out Monday morning, on the first Monday in October, that the court had denied certiorari in the case where the Fourth Circuit had decided that marriage equality was constitutionally required. And so Virginia actually had marriage equality 6 months before Obergefell, because the case that we were involved in. And I'm really proud of the fact that we are, at least I'm pretty sure we're the only marriage equality case that was brought and certified as a class action. So when we won on behalf of an estimated 18,000 couples across Virginia that we were representing through our two classes of individuals. And I think that was pretty, it's kind of like, there's a high that you get, from that kind of experience that you definitely want to try to get again. And I think that's the one day that I would, almost in my entire career, that I would say was the one I enjoyed the most. Biggest challenges going forward. Look, we are at a real inflection point in the United States of America, and we are confronting the reality that the people who have held power for a very long time in our country recognize that in a democracy determined by voting and given our demographics, that in our democracy, if our democracy functions the way it's supposed to, and people have access to the ballot box in the way they should, Martin Luther King once said, give us the ballot box, we'll take care of the rest. That in that democracy, people who've held power for a very long time are going to lose, and people don't give up power easily. And I think we're in the middle of that that fight over the power. And I'm not sure that we're certainly not done with it yet. And I said to people, and my team will tell you over and over again, I said from 2016 on that we would not use the name of the person who was in the presidency in most of our communications, because I didn't want people to think that he was the problem. He wasn't the problem. He was the symptom of the problem. And we're seeing it unfold in the way that the pandemic is killing people unequally. We continue to see it unfold in the way our police our policing affects communities differently. And we have just a lot of work to do in terms of getting to a point where the future of our country is one in which we respect the diversity of our citizenry and our residents and view it as a positive, and we allow the natural progression to take place and the next generation and the rising electorate to take the positions of power that they should have.
Yeah, we sure do still have plenty of work to do. And you talked about power, and that leads into the next question. What do you say to people who think that Virginia is really progressive now that we have a Democratic trifecta, even though there is still so much work to be done?
Politics with a small p only shifts a little bit when there are partisan swings. And yes, the partisan swing that has enabled some of the big progress we've been able to make to turn back the clock on the limits on voting that were put in place, the restrictive voter ID law, the refusal to get rid of no excuse absentee. I mean, we've made some big strides that came about because we had a shift in who was elected and what they believed and who they represented. So I don't want to underestimate that. At the same time, I don't want to overestimate it. Some of the most difficult battles that we've had, particularly in criminal legal reform, just haven't changed really. I mean, much in terms of who was in the legislature and who was in the governor's mansion. I thought that we would be able to deal with solitary confinement by executive order, and we haven't been able to. I thought it would be relatively easy to get a bill banning solitary confinement through the legislature, and we haven't been able to. The right to vote should be easy, and yet people are saying, oh, it's really, I don't know if we can let people in prison vote. And the people who are saying that are not the people that would resolutely be for law and order all the time everywhere, but the people theoretically who people perceive as being more progressive. So I think labeling people isn't very helpful. I think we just have to clarify what our values are and what we want to try to do. We need to make partners out of everybody. One of the first things that we did, and when I first came on board in 2012, was we got one of the first, I think it was the first bill in the nation passed to limit the use of drones by law enforcement. And we did that with the Tea Party and the Agribusiness Council and the Virginia Farm Bureau and with Republican patrons. And we need to really be thinking about what we want to accomplish and who we can accomplish it with. And we need to make it clear to people that as individuals, the ACLU is nonpartisan. We don't do electioneering, but every one of us, every one of you should be making clear to people who are running for office what you want from them and what you expect from them. And it's going to be really interesting to see what we really are able to get out of this session. And I'm sorry that our police accountability measure has been sent off to the Crime Commission, but it was sent off to the Crime Commission by progressives.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think a good final question. What can the average person do to help, and how can we get involved?
Well, we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Tonight, you can go on our website and find the link to the action item, and tell your senator and your delegate that you want them to vote in favor of a right to vote, not restore the vote. You can do that today. And you can follow us on social media. You can engage with us online. There are many different opportunities. You can join or start a People Power group. Peoplepower.org is our online mechanism for organizing people and allowing people to organize themselves. And our active people power group up in Fairfax has done amazing work in terms of bringing a trust act, which is an act that really resolves a number of problems with policing in the immigrant communities. They've been able to get that done by the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. They got the sheriff to stop taking money from the federal government to house people who are being detained on ICE administrative orders. So there's a lot that can be done locally. We have a Northern Virginia chapter. You can engage with them. You can find out more about them on our website. But just signing up for our emails, engaging with us on social media. We do a lot on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and you can find out all the actions that you can take during this this period in which we are all working remotely and where we aren't able to be out and about with you and go to events and table at gay pride events and do that kind of thing. It really is about being an active advocate online and learning how to do that.
Absolutely. And I have links to all of our social media accounts, so I'm about to drop those in the chat. But with that, I will hop off. Thank you so much, Claire. Back to you.
Thanks. Well, let me talk a little bit. I want to close us out by looking back and talking with you, expanding a little bit more about on what I'm proud of and what I'm thinking about as I end this 8-year tenure and begin to think about the future. And I want to really underscore how well the organization is positioned for the challenges ahead. I mentioned a minute ago that when I look back over the 8 years, I think about being the first in the nation to pass a bill that limited the ability of law enforcement to use drones. First a moratorium, and then we got a warrant requirement in place. I think about being the first in the South to win a marriage equality case, and it being the only marriage equality case that was certified as a class action. I think about our representation of Gavin Grimm over 5 years since he was 15. You know, it started with our looking at a Facebook recording of Gavin standing in front of the school board in Gloucester County and saying very simply and incredibly eloquently for a just about 15-year-old, that, you know, what all he really wanted was to be able to go to the bathroom, in the bathroom that accorded with his gender. We've been representing him now for 5 years, and we also have been happy to work with Equality of Virginia and HRC and other advocates to help pass the Virginia Values Act, which was inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity, which made it the first law of its kind in the South that was inclusive of gender identity and sexual orientation. I think about the work that we've done to abolish the death penalty and the petitions that you've signed to help end this barbaric practice and to at least bring transparency to the process while it was still in existence. We're close to a final vote that will make Virginia the first state in the South. I love this rhythm, first state in the South, to end the death penalty. I think about Mr. Reyes, who I mentioned earlier, who spent 12 years plus in solitary confinement just because he couldn't speak English, and how we got him out of that and got him some compensation. And most importantly, how we encouraged the Department of Corrections to agree in a court order to implement a policy and a practice across the system of language access for everybody who's incarcerated in their system. And I think about, you know, I look back and I think about the challenges of standing on principle, whether advocating for the free speech rights of students wanting to wear rosaries, protest gun violence, or confront racial injustice, to defending a critic of people defending Civil War monuments from a defamation action, challenging public officials who ban people from social media accounts because of what they say, and criticizing or challenging government prior restraints on speech whenever those restraints are made, whether it's by permitting decisions or by implementing regulations affecting people across the political spectrum. I mean, Governor McAuliffe implemented some regulations around the Lee Monument that restricted, they tried to say it wasn't a public forum, and they restricted the ability of people to be around the Lee Monument. And at the time he put them in place, we criticized those regulations as being contrary to the First Amendment because they were content-based and they really were talking about some people's speech and not others. You know, it was okay to have the Easter parade, but it wasn't okay to have a protest in favor of the $15 minimum wage or any other political reason. And people got all over us for trying to get in the way of what they said McAuliffe was trying to do, which was shut down white supremacists. Well, we said at the time, and it came to be true, that the first and only people that those regulations have ever been used against are people in the Black Lives Matter movement who were arrested at Marcus Davis Peters Circle, which is what we've come to call the old Lee Monument grounds. So, you know, standing on principle is something I think about. I think about the work we're doing to reframe the way we think about public safety. Look, recognizing that we got to recognize one thing: the biggest root cause of crime is what we choose to call a crime. What we choose to call a crime. We've been criminalizing for years substance abuse disorder, poverty, homelessness, mental health, and being a kid. One of our issues in the marijuana legislation is that they're making it a civil penalty or legal for adults, but they're making it a crime for kids under 18 and subjecting them potentially to being adjudicated guilty, which is convicted in juvenile justice language, and put in facilities, as opposed to thinking that is an issue that's a public health issue and something that may say that a child needs supervision, but they don't need to be incarcerated in a junior varsity prison. I think it's also important for us to recognize as advocates for civil rights that having advocated for deinstitutionalization of people with mental health issues and developmental disabilities, we have to address the reality that we've allowed our jails to become the largest mental health facilities in Virginia because we don't have and haven't invested in the community services necessary to make deinstitutionalization a reality that works. I think about the importance of finally bringing true civilian oversight to policing, getting the people being policed into the conversation about how they're being policed, and challenging excessive use of force against people exercising their First Amendment rights, or frankly, just being Black in America. I think about the possibility of finally bringing a right to vote to every Virginian over 18, no matter who they are, 18 or over, no matter who they are, where they live, and being the first state in the South to do so. I think about the reality of how deeply embedded white supremacy is in our institutions, whether the criminal legal system, our healthcare system, our schools, our government agencies, or benefit programs, and how we have to confront it every day. Right to vote is a racial justice issue. I think about the fact that when I joined the ACLU of Virginia in 2012, there were 6 of us. And now we have a diverse and engaged staff of 22, soon to be 25, all of them exceptionally skilled, passionate, and eager to keep pushing for positive change. And a number of them on our communications team have been a part of this tonight. Meredith Mason, our senior communications manager, Sam Hart, our communications associate, our newest employee, Fung Tran, who is our amazing digital assets person who's managing the video tonight, and Edith Bullard, our director of communications. They've been, and then of course our playlist is put together by Matteo Gasparotto, who's our investigator on our legal team. But we have an amazing group of people who are completely committed and work very hard every day at a job which we all have to acknowledge the work, you know, does create trauma. And it is something about which we have to be conscious all the time. But these folks are unflagging, and they are going to continue to make amazing things happen. I think about how grateful I am to all 200,000 members and supporters currently on our list. You have and you will continue to stand with our amazing board and staff in addressing racial injustice and in making sure that we really continue to keep the spotlight on the disproportionate impact of our criminal legal system on people and the uneven harm that's been visited by the pandemic on our Black and Brown communities. I want to assure you that I am not leaving at this time because I have any thought that the work is done. Far from it, just the opposite. I'm leaving so the next generation leader can take up the baton with new energy and continue to lead forward to achieve the more perfect union, the community of inclusion and belonging, the truly transformed Commonwealth to which we all must continue to aspire. The foundation, both the people, you, our board, our staff, and the financial resources on which our new leader will stand are very strong. That foundation is very strong. The future that they will confront is one of possibility, as opposed to, it's daunting possibility, but it's possibility nonetheless. And the time is indeed right in every respect for this transition. I know that all of you are going to continue to stand with and behind our new leader when they are identified and take their rightful place and help them have a career at the ACLU of Virginia that is as rewarding as the one I have been given has been. I am grateful to have had your support over the last 8 years, to have had the support of current and former board members and officers who are in a class by themselves as volunteer leaders. I am grateful for the opportunity to have worked with the people on our staff who teach me every day that I don't know what I don't know and how to be a better person and a better leader. My mother showed me, through her work as a parent advocate for my brother who is autistic, the reality of what committed people like all of you can achieve if you focus your energies on a goal. In her case, it was helping assure that the 1970 Constitution, when it was rewritten, included a right to education for all children. My father showed me what one can achieve working within a system to make change in the present and for those who follow. I want to close. I mean, he was in the Army for 39 years, and he stood out and stood up for minorities and women and their advancement throughout his entire career. And I know he would be honored by the fact that he was followed in his command by the first woman ever to be a 4-star general in the Army, and then by an African-American who also was similarly historic. But I want to close and challenge each of you with a passage that he included in a speech he gave in 1979 in accepting an award from the Federally Employed Women's Program for his work to advance women and minorities in the Army and ultimately in the Army civilian workforce. And he quoted and paraphrased the great Greek historian Thucydides. He said, and I'm quoting my dad now, in Periclean Greece, where democracy began, the historian Thucydides was once approached by a citizen with this question: "Sir, when will justice come to Athens?" And the great man, without hesitation, replied, "Justice will not come to Athens until those who are not exploited are as indignant as those who are." My father then asked in his speech, he said, "I ask today in this, the world's greatest democracy, when will justice come to America?" And his answer was that the answer is written in the heart, the mind, and the will of each of us. If we are honest, that answer is justice will not come. It is here now, if only I will take the first step. I hope you will think about what your first step might be, and that it might include actively engaging with us in the work as we build the Commonwealth and the more perfect national union to which we aspire and which we all deserve. And I hope your first step will include calling your senator and your delegate or emailing them tonight to let them know that you believe that the right to vote is something that is sacred and should be guaranteed for all. I want to thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for being with us every other day that you have been and will be. And I want to just tell you how grateful I am for the 8 years that you've gifted me with. Thank you.